Hello and welcome everybody to this panel, which is called Data Protection Scholars of the World Unite in Little Groups. Maybe it's a panel about the networking of data protection scholars, and I'm very, very happy to welcome here some great data protection scholars, some great data protection experts to discuss all this. But before we discuss, I have the most difficult thing to do today, which is to read a disclaimer to which they have to agree. So I will try to read this kindly and slowly so they can be convinced with the disclaimer. And I think maybe the disclaimers will scroll somewhere or not, because maybe there's no version in English, but I will read this properly. So before we start, please note, everybody, that the comments made by the employees of FGPV, which is the Fundação Getúlio Vargas, or any guest, which is us, do not, so the comments that we make do not necessarily represent the opinions of the institution, but our opinions. That's the point one. The point two is that we have agreed to participate here spontaneously, that we are not forced, and that by doing this, we consent to the use of our name, voice, and image for we see the property copyright scans related to this exposure and transmission, and this will be made available not forever, but for anything, but for the use of this, the transmission of this panel by this institution FGV. Through their official channels. And to continue with this transmission, everybody, I ask you to please express yourself, verbalizing or signaling your agreement with this statement. And Luca tells you how to do this, and good. Everybody did this very well. So now we can just relax and continue with the panel. That is good. So we are in a panel about networking of data protection scholars, and this is being organized by a network of data protection scholars, which, or being organized, being initiated by this network. It has been launched very recently, so it might be a bit confusing from the outside. Is there a network? Is this not a network? Is this a plan for a network? What is this? So I will try to explain this briefly before I give the floor to the speakers. What is happening exactly? Actually, there is a network which is called the Data Protection Scholars Network, which has a website, and you're all invited to go to the website. And perhaps if somebody has access to the YouTube chat, you can put the link. It's dataprotectionscholars.network. It is an initiative that was launched recently by a group of scholars in Europe to have to put in motion some networking, further networking of data protection scholars. And we did this because we think there is a need to do something else, to do something more. And we want to understand what could be done, how could we do this? And we want to understand this ideally with the help of all of you here. So people who have experience in this, in networking, privacy scholars, data protection scholars. Some of you have more, I think all of you have experience, and then also you might have also, in addition to your own experiences, just some insights about what do you think still could be tried out that has not been yet tried out, so we can think together about what could be done. So I don't want to do a very, very long introduction, but I think it's worthwhile explaining a bit of what the background of this idea. So who are we and what do we want to do? In this network, we have for now just a steering committee and a management committee. Management committee are actually the people who are going to try to put this, bring this to life. The steering committee, I'm part of this, and I'm very proud of being part of the steering committee because it's full of talented people. I can tell you all the names later. I really think that they're, like, for me, like the Power Rangers of data protection law. I feel very proud to be with them, and I really think we work like a nice team. So what is that we are fighting against or for? What we really want to do is first to acknowledge that we have something very nice at this moment with data protection law. We have a very important subject that we are all studying, that we all find it's an interesting subject. It's an important one for society in general, and we have interesting people working on it and doing interesting research. So it's not that we are saying that the situation is bad. I think the situation is good, and we should therefore try to improve the situation that we have. So I do think that we have a sort of already of a community of scholars, of data protection scholars, that we bump into each other very regularly, and that it's a good thing. And when we can meet at conferences, it's a nice thing that we meet, but we still perhaps could build on this energy, on this fact that we know each other, that we do interesting things, to do this somehow better. And there are a few points that we think we can improve. One is really the openness of the network. So how do we actually manage to see also new people occasionally? It's not that I think we are all happy to see each other, but perhaps it would be nice if there are other people in Europe, somewhere in the world that are doing interesting research, that we somehow manage to meet them, and we are not just always seeing the same people. And we know that actually there are people doing very interesting research, for instance, in Europe, that are very not fully connected to the kind of circles where we are more familiar with. And to give you an example of what do I mean with this, I'm now in Brussels. I didn't introduce myself, by the way. I am Gloria González Fuster. I'm a research professor at the Free University of Brussels in Brussels. I am in Brussels doing data protection law, but I'm originally from Spain. And I'm not always super proud of Spain, but in relation to data protection law, I am. So I know that there is brilliant data protection law scholars. There are many scholars writing very, very important books on data protection law, having great insights. And it's very difficult to get all this knowledge across, to share this with my colleagues here in Brussels, because all this knowledge is written in Spanish. When we try to get some of these people to invite them to Brussels, sometimes somebody understands what they're talking about. Sometimes the communication is not that efficient, and when the communication is efficient, it is difficult to really get the same level of discussions that we get in other places. Basically, also for a question of language, but I think there are more barriers. There are more things that make that the conversation that we could have is not as rich as we could have. So there is this question of openness, of how do we make sure that also we really bring new young people into all this network and all these brilliant kind of discussions as early as possible, and we don't wait for them to finish their PhD to know what they're working on. So many things that I will be happy to discuss more, but I don't want to do a too long introduction. So what I will do here is to briefly present the speakers, and then I will give you the floor. I will briefly introduce them in the order in which they will talk. And I thank everybody for being here. I think the holidays are starting for some, where everybody is always somehow busy. So thank you all for taking some time for this. And you all have a very, very long bios, and you have done many important things, but I will only just briefly say what is more relevant for our discussion. So first we have Professor Graham Greenleaf. You are up in my screen. You are Professor of Law and Information Systems at the UNSWV, so the University of New South Wales. And you have done many, many things, but the thing we are more interested about now here is that you are one of the founders of the Asian Privacy Scholars Network. So there is a network of scholars, of privacy scholars with an Asian scope, and we would like to hear more. And of course, I hope everybody knows about Graham Greenleaf. You are the only person on Earth who knows exactly how many privacy laws exist. And I think you all know the names of all of them, which is, I think it has to be tested, but I'm sure you know the names of all of them. So it is, of course, quite impressive. And we are very happy to have you here. The second speaker will be Margo Kaminsky. Margo Kaminsky is an associate professor of law at the University of Colorado Law, that's in the United States. And we are here also with the director of the Privacy Initiative at Silicon Flatirons, and you are, of course, a great scholar writing about privacy law. It's not only that you write very interesting things, but also we are very happy to see you sometimes in Europe. So you are one of these American scholars that dares to come to Europe and comes to Europe in a sort of friendly way, not to tell us that we got it all wrong, but really also to have discussions with us and that we can learn from each other. So that's very, very, very welcome. And you have a special role also with the Privacy Law Scholars Conference, PLSC, and that's certainly something that's very relevant for us in this spirit of how do we create a community or sustain a community and how to improve this community in some way. So we also want to hear more about this. And with this, I go to the third speaker in my list in this order, and this is Bruno Bioni. Bruno Bioni, you're somehow at the end of these little images. You are the director of the Data Privacy Brazil. You are also doing many things. We have also seen you in Brussels. I think I've seen all of you somehow in Brussels because you're all very much networkers. You are very involved in all the international discussions about data protection law, and you are, I think, a founder member or a member of this other network, which is very relevant for us, which is called the Latin American Network of Surveillance, Technology and Society Studies. So there have been networks also in Latin America, not specifically about data protection law. I think it's a broader network, but I think that's also very interesting for us to know, is this the same, is this different? What can we learn from this? So we are really looking forward to hearing about this. You are a Brazilian representative, but we have more like the local team playing today. We also have Luca Boni, who I think everybody knows at this conference because he is the director of this conference of CPDP LATAM, but Luca Boni is the director of many more things, or a few more things, notably of Cyber BRICS, this project about cybersecurity laws in the BRICS countries. So Luca, you have all this comparative view of many different laws and all sorts of experience in networking with scholars from different legal frameworks from many different places. And you have now this great experience also, I think, of trying to somehow translate or reinvent CPDP, the conference that we are quite familiar with in Brussels, to think how can this take a new life in Latin America. So that's also very, very interesting for us. And then I go to the last speaker of this panel, and this is Judith Hoffer. Judith, you used to be an academic. You used to be also, I think, a private lawyer, a solicitor. So you have many, many different perspectives on what we are talking about. As an academic, I think you were also like a cross-border academic. I think you were in moving around in different places and connecting with different people. And now you are in civil society. You are a legal officer with the Digital Freedom Fund, which is an NGO working on digital rights, I think, especially on litigation around digital rights. You will probably tell us more about this, and we are happy to have you here because of your insights as academic. I think nobody really stops being an academic, or I don't know if now you're formally as an academic, but also from civil society, and also to think what could be the relation of a network of academics with civil society, which is somehow, at least in Europe, better network. I think, or it seems to be from the outside, that the networks work quite well. So I hope everybody sees that we have many interesting things to learn from all of our speakers. And because of this, I will now just very soon give the floor to them. There will be time for questions. So if anybody has questions, please put them in the chat and they will reach us somehow. So don't worry, don't hesitate, put your comments, your questions. And also I invite all the speakers to don't be afraid to have questions for other speakers so we can have also a discussion. With this, just the last thing that I wanted to say is that we are very happy as a Data Protection Law Scholars Network, the one that we launched, to have this sort of presentation or first discussion here at CPDP LATAM, because I mentioned that we are quite familiar with CPDP. I personally just think that I love CPDP when it happens here in Brussels. I'm old enough to have experienced a world where CPDP did not exist. And I think it really made a huge difference for us, data protection law scholars in Brussels. It's such a great thing to have a big event like this with all the international speakers coming near you. And then you have every year this opportunity to meet a lot of people. And I think that's part of the thing that we want, to bring this experience to more people, to have these opportunities for connecting just for more people. With all this, I give the floor to Graham, who has a PowerPoint presentation.
Good. Thank you very much for the introduction, Gloria, and thank you to the conference organisers for allowing me to be part of this event. I'm expecting my PowerPoints will miraculously appear on the screen any second now. There we go. And as it says, I'm going to talk about the Asian Privacy Scholars Network. And there is the website of the APSN, and I want to start just with a little bit of history about the APSN and its purposes. It started in 2010, when I was starting work on writing a book, a comparative law book about Asian data privacy laws. And I had, in the preceding years, made many really valuable academic and other colleagues and contacts across a whole range of Asian countries. But I came to realise that few of them knew each other in the other countries. And I'll mention some of the reasons for that later. And that there just wasn't much transfer of ideas about data protection and privacy between different Asian countries. So I thought there was a need for some better means for people to make contact. I had a little bit of money left from a research project to call a meeting, and so organised to invite an invited meeting of 16 academics from across the Asia Pacific, from both Asia and the Pacific Rim countries, at the University of New South Wales Law Faculty. And at that meeting, we agreed that it would be a good idea to form some type of ongoing association, which became the Asian Privacy Scholars Network. Fast forward a decade later, and in 2021, APSN now has over 150 members from about 14 or 15 Asia Pacific countries, and some scholars from outside the Asia Pacific who have a particular interest in aspects of Asian data privacy laws. Now, the aim of APSN is to further the study of personal data protection, privacy and surveillance in the Asia Pacific region, primarily through conferences, publications and networking. But as I say, informally, the particular motivation was to assist Asian scholars to communicate more readily with each other. Now, one of the reasons that there's a need for this is that, unlike, say, the European Union or the rest of Europe, and even unlike Latin America, there are no regional privacy instruments, directives, regulations or whatever, or regional institutions dealing with privacy issues, whether they be courts or bureaucracies, in Asia or in any part of Asia. And partly because of that, there are there were back in 2010, no Asia-wide conferences, academic or otherwise, that drew people together. So something had to be created to create an opportunity for better contact and sharing of information. The APSN, as it's turned out, is primarily comprised of academics, but also includes some people who we regard as scholars, drawn from government, NGOs, and business, and including some data protection authorities. There's a list of all the 150 plus members on the APSN website, and looking through it tonight, I realised it's actually a very distinguished list of people from across the Asia Pacific. Now, one thing APSN is that it's not an advocacy organisation, with a very limited exception of sometimes making a recommendation to governments that they should give further study to some particular important issue, but nothing really contentious by way of advocacy. And one of the reasons is that in some Asian countries, even being a member of an organisation that advocated contentious political points of view on something like facial recognition could be dangerous for members from that country. So it's not an advocacy organisation. The basis of membership of the APSN is that members publish work on data protection, privacy and surveillance that is respected by their peers. And membership is by nomination with no objection. So once a person is nominated on the APSN mailing list to be a member, that is let stand for a week, and if no objections are raised, then the person becomes a member. There are no membership fees, and quite often no attendance fees for the conferences either, but that's up to the particular academic institution organising the conference. And sometimes there are nominal fees for any attendees other than those coming from government or commercial organisations. So that's basically how it operates. The most significant thing that I think that the APSN has done is that in its first decade of existence, it has organised 8 conferences in 6 Asian countries, or Asia Pacific countries, I should say, and the last one being in 2019, and if it hadn't been for the pandemic, India would probably have been the next host of an APSN conference. So all the details of the conferences are there. And here are some, just so you can see that they do attract real live people. Here are some photographs from some of the conferences. The one on the top left is the original gang of 16 who formed the APSN in 2010. And the photo on the bottom is the much larger group of people who attended the most recent conference in Singapore. And there's a photo from one of the conferences in Hong Kong there as well. There are some photos from other conferences in Auckland, in Hong Kong again. They've hosted it twice, and in Tokyo back in 2012. So as you can see from the various photographs, there are a lot of people from a lot of countries across Asia and the Pacific. Now, the organisational structure of APSN has essentially been a very one that takes very low organisational overhead, in that the APSN Secretariat is comprised by a combination of ex officio positions and co-option from the rest of the membership to create more balance. So the representatives of the current, past and future hosts of the conference are on the Secretariat, and then a range of other people co-opted, and at the moment giving I think a total of about 8 or 9 members of the Secretariat. And at the moment we're fortunate that the University of Hong Kong Law Faculty hosts the Secretariat and provides a part-time secretarial assistant. Now, as well as hosting the conferences, the academic outcomes that are specifically tied to the conference have been 3 particular special issues of 2 different journals, the details of which are there and links to those contents. I'll put these PowerPoints up on SSRN sometime in the next couple of days if anyone wants to go and pursue any of those things. And finally, I'd just say, in terms of, you know, what's worked well and what hasn't. Well, as I've said, I think the 8 conferences have been the main achievement, and the most important thing is that scholars from across Asia and the Pacific Rim now know many more of their peers and see them on a somewhat regular basis to exchange ideas, and are becoming familiar with them and contacting them, in between conferences. In many ways, that's more important than the fact that we've produced some special issues of journals. We have a mailing list. It doesn't spark any great amount of interesting conversation. These things rarely do spontaneously ignite, and the APSN one has not spontaneously ignited. The conferences are unlike the US and European Privacy Scholars conferences, which are based on critical and extensive examination of competitive papers. And APSN hasn't done that up to this stage, because its objective has been to encourage as many members as possible to present, particularly those who are not used to presenting to international audiences, and particularly, again, when they are not used to presenting in English. And so we want to encourage, participation by as wide a range of members of the organisation as possible. But the Secretariat concluded at our last meeting that we should try to move to a bit of a more intermediate position, and perhaps allocate half the time of the conference for more extensive presentation and critique of papers, as in the US and European conferences, but then keep the other half of the conference for short presentations by a wider range of presenters and participants, but without there being an extensive critical examination, beyond the usual couple of questions that you get at the end of a paper. So that's the details, I think. It's been a modest organisation, but we think it's served and continues to serve a valuable purpose. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation, and I think we now have this overview of what this association is about, and we will come back to you probably later with questions. But now I give the floor to Margo.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you to our hosts and organizers, to my fellow panelists, and to Gloria in particular for this invitation. And what I think is a really interesting provocation to think really deliberately about how these networks form and how particular individuals might be used to expand them. So I'm here to talk about the network of data privacy or data protection scholars in the United States, and what that looks like, how it's changing, how it relates to some of the other communities of scholars in the US, including those scholars in intellectual property law, law and technology, criminal law, national security law, even law and robotics. And in particular, how this particular network does or does not connect to transnational or international networks. So to start with what the US network looks like, I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this, but I'll try to give a little bit more of an insider's view. Despite having no real data protection law, we have an awful lot of privacy law scholars in the United States. The famous Privacy Law Scholars Conference, or PLSC, was launched back in 2008. It's usually held in June, usually in the first week. And I'm reading from the original description of the conference. It says it will bring together privacy law scholars, privacy scholars from other disciplines, including economics, philosophy, political science, computer science, and practitioners in industry, legal, advocacy, and government. What's interesting about this declaration from 2008 is that I think that while it reflects the initial goals of the conference organizers, it doesn't really reflect what the conference looks like now. So the goals of the initial organizers, who were Chris Hufnagel and Dan Solove at Berkeley and at George Washington, respectively, was to enhance ties within the privacy community and to facilitate dialogue between different parts of that community, including the academy, government, industry, and public interest. And again, while that was the initial goal of the conference organizers, it's somewhat fractured by the time we get to 2020, 2021. So Dan Solove and Chris Hufnagel led this conference from 2008 with an extensive committee from 2008 until this past year, 2020 to 21. And their program committee helped them select papers and select paper awards. I've been involved with this for around 10 years now. My first PLSC as a participant was in 2012. When I started attending in 2012, it was already a community of roughly 300 people. And it really did represent a mix of civil society and scholars, and to some extent, though not extensively, some government participants. The way it worked was that Chris Hufnagel, who is wonderful, kept an email list of invitees, and you could ask to be added to this list, but you had to be in network enough to know that you had to ask to be added to this email list. The format, as Graham mentioned, is that it's a true paper workshop. It's in fact a wonderful format as a scholar. There's no presentation by scholars at all. The conference organizers and the program committee try very hard to pair more senior commentators with more junior authors and vice versa, so that the draw to somebody coming into a room to see, say, a Danielle Citron would also include a commentator who is much more junior in level. My first commentator in 2012 was the wonderful Ryan Kalo, and it was the beginning of a much more extensive back and forth between him and me over the course of my career. So participants, as I mentioned in the beginning, really was interdisciplinary. It did include some government, some industry. It used to include far more civil society, so it's interesting to think about why that has shifted. And it did include enough of industry to really give it some practitioner applicable heft. And the strange thing about PLSC is that at the same time that it was incredibly welcoming, walking into it as a junior scholar back now 8-9 years ago, I felt immediately welcome to the space. It was also paradoxically a closed community. PLSC is not the only feature of the US privacy law network, although it's probably the most visible, especially from the outside. So I want to mention a few other features of that network, which include lead figures or nodes at different schools. And these are individuals who are particularly prominent in the community, who host events and bring together scholars, whether for talks or for symposia. So I think particularly of, again, Danielle Citron, who when she was at Maryland, she's now at Virginia Law, she used to have her law review at her school, her general interest law review, do a privacy or law and tech symposium every single year. Paul Schwartz at Berkeley, who many of you know, hosts not only various events in conjunction with the Berkeley Tech Law Center, but also an annual lecture. And he's had that annual lecture at least since 2008. The late Joel Reidenberg, who's a huge loss for our community, at Fordham held a speaker series, and he would invite individual people to present a paper and then host a roundtable of scholars discussing that paper. And then, of course, there's Georgetown's robust faculty in this space, who both have their own teaching backgrounds, and they invite people for faculty series, and they host their own sort of speaker series internally there. This includes Julie Cohen, Paul Ohm, and Meg Jones. So there are various centers in addition to these individual nodes. Some of the individuals are connected to the centers. Some of them are distinct from those centers. And these centers host privacy events, usually not just as privacy events, but within larger series on law and technology. So again, I think of Fordham and Reidenberg's CLIP, the Berkman Center, Berkeley Center for Law and Technology, the Yale's Information Society Project, of which I was the head for several years, NYU's Engelberg Center, and Colorado's Silicon Flatiron Center, where I am now. I would be remiss to talk about the US network without also talking about our practitioners. And by practitioners, I don't just mean people who are in industry or civil society. There's a robust clinical practice within the United States that actually often involves privacy law in some way, ranging from amicus efforts in particularly big cases to providing comments on administrative actions. And those robust clinical practices, just to name a few schools where they're at, they have their own network too. So there is a clinical law faculty event that happens almost yearly now, I think, that's specific to law and technology clinical faculty. And those clinics are established at Berkeley, at Georgetown, at NYU, at Harvard, and proudly at my own Colorado Law School. I mentioned civil society organizations. So these organizations have a role in the scholarly community in the United States in that they often end up being the recipients or the trainers of our students, who then come up and then either go into clinical practice or come back into the scholarly community. In addition, these civil society organizations often cooperate with the robust clinical practices I mentioned earlier, or reach out independently to the network of scholars to have them involved again in policy work. And those organizations include the ACLU, Electronic Frontier Foundation, which has had a mixed background with privacy, though that's also my alma mater, and Data and Society, just to name again a few. Additionally, there are expert organizations that have really formed more around practitioners, but still have a connection to the academic community. I'm thinking here of the IAPP and also of the Future of Privacy Forum. And increasingly, we see as a venue, especially as the amount of lawmaking in the United States has really ramped up in the last several years, actual government venues. So the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, hosts events pretty regularly at which they bring academics, industry experts, technologists, et cetera. And we see legislative efforts on a more local level, including state by state. So how this has been changing, interestingly, and sort of sadly, there's been a combination of a deliberate handoff and a generational shift because we have very unfortunately lost several lead figures in this field. This last year, in the last, I guess, roughly year and a half, we've lost both Joel Reidenberg and Ian Kerr, who, while he was Canadian, was very tied into this US network and also helped to bring some of the more cross-border conversation into that network. We're also seeing a more deliberate handoff from one generation to the next. Chris Hoofnagel and Dan Solov actually have stepped down as the leadership of the PLSC, and the current chair of that conference, both last year and this upcoming year, is Ari Waldman of Northeastern, who is roughly my peer in terms of time on tenure track. So I've been a member of the program committee for the Privacy Law Scholars Conference in the US. This will be my second year serving. And in the past year, I can talk about some of the fundamental changes that have been made. We've moved from, and this is in response to feedback from the community and from people outside the community who felt that it was too closed. We moved from a closed email list of participants to an open call for submissions. So if you are interested in submitting to PLSC from anywhere in the world, you can now do that without having to go through the additional hurdle of being looped into that community. We have an attempt at basically using the same sort of screening, quality screening as happens for other peer-reviewed conferences within PLSC. So there's an attempt at anonymous review, though it's not perfect. There's been an active attempt to broaden the community, including to broaden its diversity along multiple axes, including not just passive opening of the community, but also active outreach. There's now a very deep concern with diversity and inclusion and making sure that PLSC is not self-replicating along certain class, gender, socioeconomic, or racial lines. And there's a deep concern at the same time with retaining this PLSC identity or brand, that friendliness and support that I mentioned earlier, even as it opens up to becoming a much more broad community. At the same time, I have noticed, this is my observation, not speaking for the committee as a whole, that civil society has become significantly less visibly involved over the last 10 years. Industry has largely split off, so now there are other events, both through the IAPP, and the Privacy and Security Forum comes to mind, which is Paul Schwartz and Dan Solov's professional organization, an event that they hold biannually. There's a question of which happens everywhere, I think, what topics actually are considered to be privacy or data protection. So algorithmic accountability, for example, has really spawned a host of different conferences, including interdisciplinary conferences. And there's basically an annual question of how much overlap there is between algorithmic accountability and privacy law. And then interestingly, as we're developing privacy legislation in the United States, I predict this is going to change the tone of PLSC, depending on how much of PLSC ends up being focused on the adoption of this legislation versus thinking more critically, as it has in the past, about privacy in society. So just briefly, I want to talk about how this community in the privacy context relates to other communities of scholars in the United States. There are many overlaps with other scholarly communities in the US between privacy law and these other communities. And I'm saying overlap rather than subsets because many people do multiple things and they do them not necessarily coextensively. So you may have a scholar like me, for example, who has done work in intellectual property law, some work in First Amendment law, and also work in privacy law. And each of those sort of has its own set of conferences, individuals, nodes, et cetera. So some privacy law scholars in the US are criminal law scholars, and they're tied into a network of people who talk about criminal law writ broad. Some are national security law scholars, and so there's a group within the privacy law community that also circulates within the national security law community. Some, as I mentioned, do IP law, and many of us, if not most of us, are also law and technology scholars, which means that we sort of take what we can in terms of what laws are being passed about law and technology. So just some examples of this. There is a community of scholars who almost all of whom I believe are involved in PLSC, who created a conference called We Robot, and that was Ryan Kalo, Michael Frumkin, and the late Ian Kerr's event. Similarly to PLSC, held annually, rotated location. And I think that really those sub-communities both strengthen the robustness of the community as a whole and allow these sort of separate, how would I call it, just like there's their own separate little subsets within that community with specializations to form. All right, so last but not least, how this community or these communities do or do not connect to transnational or international networks. And this probably saddens me the most because while our data privacy law and data protection law community is very strong in its own right, the story of how it connects to other networks really is a story largely of individuals and individual efforts. And as we all know, individually driven connections are less robust than institutionally driven connections. So just to think about this a little bit in terms of the track record of US scholars, there are big names in US privacy law, including, again, the late Joel Reidenberg and including Paul Schwartz at Berkeley, who deliberately write about transnational or comparative privacy law largely between the US and the European Union. And these scholars have their own networks as individual nodes abroad. There's also, I wanted to mention Peter Swire, who is more squarely involved through the government. And I've seen him every single year that I've gone to CPDP in the EU. There's also a number of individuals who have come through Fulbright programs. So that's really my entree into this space. I was at EVIR in Amsterdam and then for 3 months at Scuola Santa Anna in Pisa. Dennis Hirsch was at EVIR. Bill McGevern went to Ireland for a year, I believe, for 6 months. And several other scholars who have otherwise spent time abroad or otherwise networked into European circles, not through Fulbright programs. And here I think of both Neil Richards and Meg Jones. There are several of us who individually are driven to come to CPDP EU as much as possible. But there's really, as I mentioned, nothing systemic, nothing institutional on the US side of things. When we have European voices or international voices, even more rarely, who come sporadically into the US conversation, it's largely through the networks of these individuals that I've named. And we often get repeat players, as Gloria mentioned. US scholars really, unfortunately, rarely read the data protection scholarship unless it somehow shows up at PLSC, which is somewhat the curation method by which many people decide what they're going to read every year. And then our connections, as I mentioned, are largely through these individual efforts limited to Europe, with a few exceptions, including Woody Hartzog, who I believe has tried to tie himself into the Asian Privacy Scholars Network. So in closing, I'm hoping that by doing what Gloria has suggested we do and thinking about being more deliberate about this, it can be a little bit more successful, more institutional, less haphazard. And it ties into right now an important moment in the US in general, but particularly the Privacy Law Scholars Network, in trying to push for increasing the breadth and diversity of voices within that network, including an increasing acceptance of co-authorship, which often provides a way for people to tie into a community. And just as an ending provocation, I want to note that I do think we face pretty significant, not just institutional issues, but translation issues, not just with respect to languages, but also with respect to the types and styles of scholarship and journals that are involved in different countries. Even when it comes down to basic terminology, many US scholars don't understand that there is a difference between the word privacy and the term data protection. And many don't understand the difference between comparative legal structures or comparative constitutionalism, some of which is really significantly important for trying to speak across borders in this space. So thank you again for giving me a moment to discuss this, and I really look forward to hearing what all the rest of you have to say.
Thank you very much. I think I never in my life have seen this very neat, well-organized overview of everything that happens in the United States. So for me, it was a pleasure to listen. But we continue our exploration, our traveling around, and we move south now with Bruno. Can you tell us how do things look from your perspective?
Yes. Thank you, Gloria, for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. I'd like, first of all, to pose some basic questions for reflection, and specifically about how is needed to have a scholar data protection network. I think that the need for such a network is directly linked to the genesis of our subject, of our object of study, at least from a legal point of view. I'm a lawyer and a PhD candidate at the law faculty as well. So if you in a retrospective look, if you analyze the development of data protection from the elaboration of the Fair Information Practice Principles passing through the OECD guidelines and arriving at the Convention 108 and the protocols, it's possible to observe a connecting thread, a phenomenon of a regulatory convergency that in a way lead us to an interoperability approach. This interoperability must not only be a regulatory, but also academic. And this is why I think we need an interoperable data protection law scholars or scholars network. And I'm purposely using the term interoperability to stress that this interaction between scholars must not reproduce colonialist or dominant relations, but rather of exchange, respecting and recognize the difference in our political, cultural, and economic context. And then it is precisely by analyzing this diversity of contexts that we can arrive at a core issue. If a data protection law scholar network is highly desirable nowadays, why we are not there yet? And there are several social and economic challenges faced by some countries that pose barriers that we need to address. Many of them well known by the Global South. Language, it was already mentioned, is one of such barriers, but it's not the only one. And just to give an example, the last meeting symposium event organized by LAVITS was held on both Portuguese and Spanish, because even here in Latin America, we face that kind of barrier in terms of language. And another one is, of course, the lack of resource. It is an undeniable challenge that makes very difficult for countries, particularly from the Global South, to engage in any kind of network. For instance, in Brazil, we are facing successful cuts in education funds that have made progressively hard for academic research to succeed. And if this systematic hardship constitutes a problem for social science to sustain themselves internally, let alone engage in a regional or even in a global initiative. So recognize such socio-economic disparities. How can building a scholars network and help to reduce this type of resource asymmetry in terms of incentives? Perhaps serving as a hub, not just for exchange results, but also for attracting cross-regional research funding and consequently diversifying academic knowledge, perhaps. And also, I would like to give a concrete example. For instance, LAVITS was initially funded by the International Development Research Center, which is a Canadian or international funding. That was, now we are reaching the eighth seminar, because the first one was just made possible because of that kind of international philanthropy organization. And another point that I think we should bear in mind is that nowadays the political situation increasingly affects the agenda of our research agenda, and even the very freedom of expression of academics. In some countries, with authoritarianism shifts, it is inescapable to have as an object of study the intersection between data protection and democracy. And that was the last two conference of LAVITS, the main topics, the main, let's say, research agenda was about asymmetries and invisibilities, surveillance, gender, and race. And the last one was about surveillance, democracy, and privacy in Latin America, and specifically about vulnerabilities and resistance. So I think that we should bear this in mind, because perhaps that topic is not urgent in some countries or even in major parts of the global north, but it is extremely important in Latin America or even in the major part of the global South global countries. And perhaps I think a conference and committees whose calls accommodate this different voice and this openness for topics and for that kind of a framing of research agenda is very needed as well. I think we have several challenges that I've already mentioned, but I think and I do believe that there are a lot of opportunities too. So how we can build solutions to build a stronger scholars network. And I think my overall impression, based on the speech of my colleagues that have already talked, is that we already have very interesting and well-established regional initiatives. And our initial strength lies on recognize this and boosting what we already have. In this sense, and answering one of the panel's guiding questions, it seems to me that this new initiative could function as like a super node that connects these regional nodes. For instance, LAVITS, which I'm part of, already has a track record of bringing together academics in the region of Latin America, and more interesting in an interdisciplinary way. The founders of LAVITS, all of them are from political science, geography, and so on. None of them are lawyers. They were very, very, very kindly to accept me in this network. And this is a very, and that kind of approach is very, very rich. For instance, when in the last conference, when we were discussing about surveillance and the territory, we have the approach and inputs from guys from geography, political science, and of course of lawyers. And I think that the same happens with the Asian Pacific network. So I think that this kind of network, and you are already witnessing the nodes of this network seem already to exist, but something is needed to connect them. Perhaps this is the main task of this movement in terms of unity, as the title of this panel also provokes. So to conclude, I like to reinforce that and emphasize how necessary and welcome an academic data protection network is necessary. And I think the regulatory convergence and the interoperability trends facilitates it. But I think this is a kind of a broader movement. And here, trying to establish a dialogue with the Professor Colin Bennett, which is one of the main academics in our field and who has been studying regulatory convergence in depth for decades, because academics too are, as one of his last books suggests, privacy advocates, people who dedicate their time to produce knowledge in order to strengthen this fundamental right in a transnational way. So I think that therefore is also important not to lose that kind of perspective and values to oxygenate this kind of network and the knowledge that we want to produce. So that's it. I'd like to thank you again for having me.
Thank you. And actually, we saw Colin Bennett in a slide by Ragnar, so I think he's very present in all these discussions. Thank you very much. You have a fellow Brazilian with you. So we have a fellow Brazilian with us. Luca, something that you would like to add from your perspective?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I really enjoyed all the historical perspective and the great presentations of the previous speaker. And my input to this discussion is twofold. On one hand, I would like to present a little bit how we have constructed CPDP LATAM and why we have shaped it in this way. And on the other hand, I would like to highlight some thoughts on how this network of scholars, or I would say an internet of privacy scholars, I would specify why I'm choosing this term, could be meaningful, and how I would suggest that could be shaped. Well, first of all, my name is Luca Boni. I know well some of you, but not everyone. So I'm professor here at FGV Law School, where I had the Center for Technology and Society. And then some of you may know me for other hats, like this CyberBRICS project that Gloria was kindly mentioning before. So, and over the past decade or so, a little bit more, I've been both in the academic sector and in the intergovernmental sector for some time. So I've also had some experience of how the kind of thinking that may have governments when approaching academics. Then I prefer to the academic life because of the leeway and freedom it affords to academics, but that is another story. So coming back to how we decided to create CPDP LATAM, we decided to create it as a hybrid, as a sort of transgenic item that combines all the conferences that we thought were very worthy bringing to Latin America. Because the problem of Latin America is that, yes, of course, it had already a network like Didnt, but it did not have a platform, a multi-stakeholder platform. That was also the original aim of the Privacy Law Scholars Conference, that then became a purely academic, or with some practitioners, of course, but mainly academic conference. And indeed, when we created CPDP LATAM, also we tried to combine it with Privacy Law Scholars Conference and create a LATAM version of it. And the idea, if we had not an online event, but a in-person event, would have been to have also a full day dedicated to Privacy Law Scholars LATAM. And then, as it is already extremely complicated to organize a fully online event, we decided to have a satellite event. We will actually announce it today at the plenary session. So this is something that I can announce only for you and those who are connecting this moment. But we plan to have a satellite event dedicated to AI and protection in September, where we will have some sessions of privacy of this first Latin American Privacy Law Scholars Conference. And also we also included in CPDP LATAM the Latin American version of the My Data conference, which is yet another conference that we have been working with over the past years, and that we thought was extremely worthy bringing to Latin America. And so we have chosen CPDP as the main platform because it is a multi-stakeholder conference by design. But then this allowed us to have spin-offs and plug in also other conferences that were very beneficial for the region, right? So in this sense, we have created as a platform that allows this multi-stakeholder dialogue to have researchers and regulators, business leaders, innovators. But then this is also something that if you analyze the conference from a purely academic perspective, inevitably brings a little bit down the level of depth of the analysis, because we all know it. When you have 1 hour to present a paper and to receive comments, you have a much deeper analysis than when you have 15 minutes or 10 minutes or 8 minutes to present your idea in a few slides. But on the other hand, if you have a multi-stakeholder conference, you might have higher chances that your idea are used by regulators or business leaders, and you might hear refreshing thoughts about what business leaders are trying to adopt or what regulators are planning to regulate about. So I think that both formats are very interesting and useful. But my suggestion if we want to create this kind of network of data protection scholars would be first to analyze what are the challenges that we phase. So we want to create a multi-stakeholder network. We want to create a purely academic network. We want to create a big stakeholder network of academics and practitioners. Those are fundamental questions we have to ask ourselves before starting, or well, at this moment at least. Then if we want to have a big stakeholder network, like could be the International Association for Privacy Practitioners, where you have academics and practitioners, we may be seen as competitors of what already exists, and I don't know to what extent this could be useful. My personal take is that an internet of data protection scholars would be useful, meaning a network of networks, something that makes, as Bruno was very rightly saying, interoperable the existing network in the sense of creating a dialogue, because there will never be, in my view, a global entity that allows everything to be streamlined and well organized according to the format pre-designed by this global entity. But it would be very useful and very meaningful and feasible, I think, to create a network of networks, meaning some points of contact of the existing initiatives that are very interesting, in order to maybe have a session if in any of these conferences analyzing a specific topic that is of common interest. There are a lot of topics, as Bruno also was mentioning now, that several regions face. Maybe there is more a higher commonality of interest between the North America and Europe, but the rest of the world is equally, if not numerically, more important than North America and Europe, and is frequently neglected. There are some very good initiatives like the network that Graham Greenleaf has created and spearheaded, but what I think would be very meaningful would be to create points of contact between this network, and maybe with a very light organization suggest annual topics that could be of common interest and analyzed in different ways by the various network. I don't know, interoperability or data portability. Well, interoperability as a precondition to facilitate data portability, or data portability, just to name one, which is of common interest and no one has really a clear solution nowhere at this moment. That could be feasible, actually, and perhaps having a session in every of the conference, and allow also some sort of cross-fertilization, inviting some speakers from one conference to the other. And in this, maybe not on an annual basis, but on a biannual basis, may lead to some sort of publication. And this is kind of incentive that encourages academics to participate. But of course, the greatest challenge that one faces is sustainability. Both in financial terms, not all scholars around the world are so lucky as European and North American scholars to have well-funded universities and to have this fund in euros or dollars, so, and not to be subject to very unforeseeable fluctuations of their currencies. So it would be good to have some sort of funding for scholars that cannot afford traveling. I have the privilege to work for a very well-funded organization, but it's really a unique, one of the very few organizations that can afford this privilege in Brazil and in Latin America. So the majority of speakers, you might have seen myself in conferences because I am a very privileged person, but the rest of the Latin America is not. And the reason why we also try to look at funding to bring people here when we will have the conference here in Rio de Janeiro, or we were to some extent happy that we have an online event so that everyone can participate, is precisely because traveling to CDPP or to Privacy Law Scholars Conference in itself is a huge cost for someone that comes from a low-income or middle-income country. So even if your paper is accepted and you have a very high number of extremely high barriers. It's not only language, it's about costs, and also, well, it's about also the interest that a person, an academic or another stakeholder may have in a specific conference. So I think we may also think about what are the incentives that drive participation. You might have mini grants for authors. We experimented this very successfully in this first set of publications we had with CPDP LATAM call for papers. We received 107 submissions, which is something that I never received in a previous call for papers, because we gave some grants for authors, and this also was a very good way to support research in a moment where, of course, if we speak to people in the global north, they understand the difficulty of the current pandemic, but they may not be able to understand the economic tragedy that is in the global south in this moment. So the fact that you give also some grants for people to develop research is a very good way to support people and incentivize them to participate in this kind of network. And also, again, this perspective of a publication, or the perspective of visibility speaking, if we want to attract, for instance, some non-academic stakeholders, we may give some visibility to regulators or business leaders. That is something always very interesting for them. And so I think that if we think strategically about this, having sustainability in mind, having a very light organizational structure in mind, and trying to shape this as a network of networks, we might be very successful with limited effort. But we really have to think as any project manager before we start to what can possibly go wrong, so that we have solutions, or at least possible solutions, before we start. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I thought we had plenty of time, but time flies very fast. So, and indeed, we don't have a lot of time. Now there's still one speaker. I will have many reactions. Just a small comment. Luca, you seem like take a bit for granted that we have those networks that can be networked easily, but I'm not so sure that we have those real networks that can be easily networked. We do have things. Our feeling is that what we have is not that easily. You cannot really start building a lot of Lego easily with this. I don't know, maybe it's something is of course possible, and we should think what is possible. But we can have a discussion after. Now I give the floor to Judith.
Thank you very much, Gloria. Thank you very much, and also thank you very much for inviting me, CPD LATAM. It's a real challenge to follow such a distinguished panel of speakers, not just because of the, but also because I original note about lots of things I could want to add to what I was originally saying. Gloria is right. I am a hybrid flower when it comes to being a data protection scholar. I've done all sorts of stuff. I was in legal practice. I was an academic for 15 years, and I've only very recently, about 4 months ago to be precise, moved over to civil society, where I'm now working as a legal officer for the Digital Freedom Fund in Berlin. I think what I've learned from my travels is three things that I wanted to quickly go into as part of this. Basically, first of all, I think one of the reasons why a privacy scholars or data protection law scholars network would be a really good idea and really useful is the question of exchange and gaining new perspectives. This has been mentioned by quite a few of you, particularly with regard to language barriers. Gloria, I hear you so much, because this is exactly my experience that I had as a originally a German lawyer in the UK, where I was teaching people in English. I was talking about concepts in English, and of course, I knew that there was this body of data protection scholarship back in Germany that goes back all the way to the 70s and 80s, and I just could not bring that over. And if I wanted to set my students a reading list, then automatically they would default. And this is not meant as, a bad thing generally, but automatically they would default to people like Dan Solow and, a lot of the American scholars. And while that is very valuable scholarship in itself, it also disregards a lot of, European scholarship that has gone way before anything that has happened in the last 10 or 15 years. So, I think there is one article by Spiro Simitis that is actually available in English, which I'm, still handing out, even though it's dating back to 1987. But it's not just that. I think there is another issue about this, and this is something that I've really particularly learned in these 4 months already that I've worked with the Digital Freedom Fund, and that is that how important it is to gain new perspectives by talking to people, not just with different languages, but different cultural outlooks. I've made those conversations, I've made those experiences myself. I've had conversations and I've had involvements in projects that did involve other privacy cultures. I've been involved with Ola Linsky over the last 3 years in writing a new Commonwealth data protection model law. And in that context, we've actually spoken to a lot of scholars from Commonwealth countries. We have also done some consultancy for the Canadian Privacy Commissioner's Office, who is currently trying to bring some sort of global data protection standard. And I think when you're talking to people from different backgrounds, you actually realize that the way in which you think about your own field, about your own law, it is not the way that everybody thinks about this. And this goes to really sort of broad brush issues, as in, are individual rights actually a good thing or a bad thing? You know, when you're talking to people in Asian countries or in some African countries who have an Ubuntu understanding of human rights, then, you know, this idea of individual rights, and including the individual data protection right or privacy right, is not actually as common as we over here in Europe seem to think about it. So there is a lot of opportunity to learn from each other. But what I think my work for DFF has told me is the importance of what Bruno already mentioned, of that work not being colonialist and not being extractive. And I think that is a very important issue that we need to bear in mind if we want to work globally in this, because I have learned just as much about perspective, about different priorities, about just different factual backgrounds. Only recently I had a conversation with a colleague of mine where I was bemoaning, you know, the idea of digital colonialism in Africa because of, you know, the lack of data protection structures, and this idea of collective harms that come from online tracking. And she was just like, not in Africa, because, you know, always 10 people share a mobile phone, so you're having a completely different situation. So these are the kinds of things I think that you will only learn from each other if you're looking at if you're exchanging information. The second aspect, I think, where this is really important is support, providing mutual support and capacity building. So this is another thing that I learned from the project I did with the Commonwealth Secretariat, where we had all the support and all the mutual collaboration that we needed with regard to creating this new data protection model law. And then I actually was hired again by the Commonwealth to sort of represent them in Namibia, which was at that point in time in the process of developing a new national data protection law. And we were there to sort of provide advice and support. And what I realized was that it wasn't just about getting new laws in place. The problem would have been that once the laws were in place, there were just not an awful lot of people there who would have been able to apply them and enforce them. So there was a capacity building element to it, which I think we often underestimate. And you know, what I realized, particularly with my work in Africa, was that in many countries, there is often a lot of multitasking going on where people who have a certain level of qualification, knowledge, skill, and experience, they are not just data protection scholars. They also will have government positions. They will probably do some legal practice on the side, and they will teach at university. So there is a lot of that. And I think, again, in terms of capacity building, a global network could probably work a lot in this context, both inside academia, but also possibly more importantly, and I say this with my civil society hat on, by actually sharing knowledge with civil society organizations and digital rights organizations all over the world. And the third third point, I think, where could be really important is the development and influencing global policy initiatives. Now, I don't know how you feel about this, but I'm old and cynical these days. And, the idea of a global data protection law has sort of, I've long since lost hope of that. But I see young scholars coming through who still actually seem to be thinking that this might be happening in their lifetime. But in order for that to happen, and in order for there to be, a good way of doing this, and an interactive and collaborative way of doing this, I think, again, those of us who are actually working in the field need to collaborate with each other and need to actually get a real understanding of where everybody is coming from. And then finally, from a civil society perspective, I was thinking back as I was listening to all of you, what my experience is of the overlap between scholarship, being a scholar, and being now in civil society. And I think what Margo, I think, mentioned, or I can't actually remember who mentioned it, civil society as trainers of the young. I think it was Margo, to send our students into that. Well, I can imagine, I can completely sign up to that, because I've just spent 3 months supervising 2 interns at DFF who came in from the Berkman Center. So, remote interns, in this particular context. But it was a really, really interesting experience, I hope, for both of us. Definitely it was for me. I can also, I've been on the advisory committee of the UK Open Rights Group for probably the last 10 years. Not anymore now because of my new job. But I think there is also a very clear connection between a lot of data protection scholars who are acting as advocates, in real life. We are not just advocates in our scholarship. We are advocates in real life by providing advice, real advice to civil society organizations. And DFF, for instance, has a panel of experts, as some of you may know, who are participating in advising the organization, in making grant decisions and all of this sort of stuff. So this is, I think, really, really important. And I think what we need to go forward in this context, I'm somewhere in between the whole idea of what Luca just put forward about a network and networks and a more global thing. I think there are a number of things to consider in this context. One of them is, I suppose, that purely organizationally, there is a lot to be said in favor of a network of networks, because you just keep closer ties with your own network anyway, and I think it's easier to manage. On the other hand, I suppose there is a danger or a risk of a certain siloization. And I think one of the things, and I've been going over to PLSC conferences as well in the past, and I actually have to echo some of the things that Margot says, as it's part of the experience that people probably had. I did feel often as an outsider, as European. It was this question of, this is not my clique, I am a visitor here. And I think on the one hand, as I say, organizationally, it might work. On the other hand, it would be nice to break down some of these barriers. And I've looked at the changes that PLSC has made over the last year, and with a lot of hope and with a lot of enthusiasm. And I probably won't make it over this year, but I'm definitely, when we can travel again, would love to come back. But this, I think, is the sort of thing that we need to think about. To what extent is conversation actually improved by a network of network, and to what extent would we be building new barriers in this context and create new bottlenecks, shall we say, where again only the same people are in the room and who are talking to each other. Because if we're getting to that situation, even though we might be giving some new voices more room to speak, we would at the same time be creating barriers for other voices, I think. And that is one of the most important things that I think I am looking for at the moment. So I'm looking at the time, so I'm going to stop here and give Gloria the ability to actually ask some questions.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure there are questions from the audience. Our remote moderator hasn't said anything. Good. So I would suggest, there are many themes that I think are very important that were mentioned by all of you. And I would just mention 2 points that I think are important to me especially, or many are important. And then I will give each of you 2 minutes so you can react to whatever you like, to my points, to anybody else's points, if that's fine for you. The 2 points I want to mention. The first one, I think it's interesting, this question of who are we and how different are we, and do we want to have a sort of demarcation with the others? And I hear from many of your reflections that the point is, of course, not to create something about data protection scholars, because we want to be multi-stakeholder, we want to be with the government, with the industry, with everybody. It makes sense, of course, that our object of study we need to study other things, and it makes sense. But at the same time, there is something that I don't like to have all the time, is that all the time being in this position where you're indeed somehow like the black sheep in the picture. And Bruno was saying, like, this network was very kind to accept me as a data protection scholar, and I feel this often at conferences that I find super interesting, and I read all the books of these people, and I follow the discussions, and then when I take the floor, I have to apologize. I'm just a data protection scholar. I'm sorry to be here. Sorry to bother you with the GDPR. Please believe I'm a nice person. It would be nice to have a sort of safe space for where you don't have to apologize for thinking that the GDPR is important, and then you can just meet people like this, and not just all the time meeting these people, but a place where that's fine. And I think that would be nice, especially for PhD students that are doing their PhD about the GDPR. Why do they have to apologize all the time? So that's a point for me, if you have any reflection about this. And the second point is about the sustainability, the question of money. Where does money come from? So the grants, I believe the grants are a great idea. Now in this network that we are trying to launch here in Europe, of course, the first question is, how do we make this sustainable? Who is going to pay for the website? Now it's the pocket money of somebody. Who pays for the email account? Is my pocket money. So all this, if you don't go institutionally, if it's not a university like the Hong Kong University kindly doing this, or an individual kindly doing this, but then you're stuck to this individuality. If you really want to do this as the Power Rangers, as a team, as a network, as an anonymous thing, it becomes complicated unless you have some institutional support. And for us, it's clear that it cannot be Facebook, it cannot be Google, it cannot be a company. It has to be an institution, but which one? It cannot be a government. So we kindly ask European institutions who do give money to DPA, so data protection authorities. That's very important. Capacity building for data protection authorities internationally. Give them plenty of money to train them, but we are training the scholars, and we are not supposed to get money for this, for doing this network. This is where we are now. That I hope somebody hears me and decides that they should give us money. Where do you think the money could come from? That would be the second big question. And with this, all of you have 1.5 minutes. Graham, should you start? Microphone. Yes. Still not hearing you, Graham. No. Strange.
I'm happy to jump in while we sort that out. So just briefly, this reminds me a lot of the conversations that were had in the Access to Knowledge Network, which, if you all recall, whether you're involved with it or not, was the global transnational network around basically civil liberties, human rights, and intellectual property transnational agreements. So this is looking back, again, easily 10, 15 years. The difference between the kind of network we're proposing and that network, I think, there were very similar conversations about capacity building, very similar conversations about network of network and nodes and that sort of thing. The difference is that was definitely an advocacy geared network, in a way that I just want us to recall what Graham said about building the Asian Privacy Scholars Network, about some individuals coming from some countries needing specifically to distance themselves from advocacy. Capacity building, I think, is key. It very much was part of that conversation as well. The solution that was sort of proposed there was that there was an annual conference, and there were grants for people to attend that annual conference, and the annual conference moved from country to country. I'm thinking sort of creatively about how I can go back into the Privacy Law Scholars Network in the US, and maybe mini grants are one idea, right? As Luca discussed. Another idea would be to have conference paper awards. I'm just coming up with conference paper awards that actually are in the form of grants for travel, so that if we have awards in the US PLSC, we could actually give those people a grant for money to travel to another country's version of PLSC, and try to just, even with the little tiny start of having maybe 1 to 3 papers a year move transnationally, use that as a form of capacity building and vice versa. But thank you again, Gloria. This has just been a great conversation. I've got a lot to think about.
Thank you very much. Graham, yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Just picking up on what Margo said, when our Japanese colleagues at Meiji University hosted 2 APSN conferences, they had some money in a grant they'd obtained that was enough to provide about $500 subsidies to maybe about 8 or 10 people for each conference, that was enough money to fly, at any rate, from any point in Asia to Tokyo, with, depending where you came from, a bit of money left over for hotel expenses. That was very valuable, and I think Singapore did that a little bit, and that as well. The APSN has basically kept expenses to nothing by getting a donation of a little bit of time from University of Hong Kong and a bit of web space. And Ostly at my university has run the mailing list, and but the expense is being kept down. I'll just say one more thing, and that is, I think the suggestions of a network of networks are an appealing one, and that's not inconsistent with there being some global conference that central network of networks could attempt to run with small travel grants and migration from the conference from one country or from one continent to another. It's feasible.
Good.
I'll stop.
Excellent. We have three minutes left, so quickly passing the ball to Bruno.
Yes, just to agree with the last words of Professor Greenleaf, it looks like the theory of nodal governance, so you have some kind of nodes in these kind of networks. So Lavitz could also operate like that by selecting some papers or by even funding some professors of Latin America to go to this kind of global network and other nodes in North America, USA, Canadian, plus Mexico, depends what kind of map are you looking for, and so on. So this is my impression about it. And also I agree with you, Gloria, that we have to take into account what is needed, a multi-stakeholder global conference or academic conference. And I worked for Brazilian Internet Steering Committee of Governance for years. I love multi-stakeholder model, but it seems to me also that it is necessary to have some really deep academic conversations and then put this in another track that is the timing, and even the framing is a little bit different.
Thank you. Luca, 30 seconds.
I will use the first part of my 30 seconds to announce that we try to shape CPDP Latam in a little bit more flexible way. So if we have 3 minutes more, it's not a problem. Nobody will disconnect the wires, right? So and then I will abuse of my time to very extensively reply to your comments. No, I'm joking. I will just make 2 very quick comments. One about the network of network I see is triggering a lot of interesting reactions, and I both the funding and the network of network comments are driven by very pragmatic nature. It's very good to have an idea. The most difficult thing is not to have a good idea, but to put it into practice, right? So at the end of the day, someone has to pay the bill if you want to have a nice global conference where people come from everywhere, from every part of the world. So funding is necessary and some organization is necessary. I would disagree, Gloria, with your comment that you would not accept money from someone, but from someone else, because honestly, having been in academia for some time, I might have a very long list of complaints and reasons why any funder may be avoided, because at some point in time they did something horrible. Like, I mean, thinking that European Union agencies are supporting and the money that they receive is fine and better than money from someone else. I think it's a little bit naive, especially if you consider this in a global perspective, meaning a lot of countries that have been colonized by European countries that have contributed to the European wealth, current European wealth with previous extractionism. So I would refrain from this kind of comment, and I would just repropose the idea of looking for funding. I'm not pointing into any direction, but I'm just saying that funding is essential, and that all funders have some dark secret in there somewhere, and then it's up to us. The only way to have a good funding with no funders is if you have fees, but then it requires people to pay for the conference. And then the network of network idea is also based on the fact that people that created networks like Lavitz, CPDP Latam, Privacy Law Scholars Conference, they already dealt with these problems. And so they already have somehow the organization to deal with this, and they may facilitate an interoperable network of network, which means both there will still be discussions in the silos, of course, but there will also be discussions globally, which I think should be the aim, at least, of this network of Internet of Scholars. And I think in this way, I see it as something more feasible. Of course, I would love to have a global conference where everyone is invited. We stay 5 days in a beautiful country, and everyone is flight there, and everyone participates, and everything is discussed. But I'm not sure this is feasible.
Just to clarify, my comment is not that you cannot organize events with private funding, but I will find very inconvenient if a network of European data protection law scholars was funded by an American company with a business model based on processing personal data. So that kind of network, an association of data protection law academics funded by this company as such, that would be, for me, conceptually strange. I very much understand that, of course, an international event is a different kind of discussion. So it's not that I'm saying that all private funding is a problem. Just some private funding, I think, for me, it's more delicate. But last word goes to Judith.
Okay. Thank you, Gloria. I don't particularly think we have time to have that conversation, although it would be a brilliant conversation to have at some point, actually. I think what both what you said and what Graham actually said earlier about APSN sort of jogged a memory in my mind about a funding model, just to put that on the board as well, that I am familiar with from a UK organization, or UK and Irish organization called BILITA. It's the British and Irish Law Education and Technology Association. And they actually are funded by institutional membership. So basically it is they charge a membership to the universities, to the law schools, not a very high one actually, but to enough schools to make a difference. And from that money, they fund the website. From that money, they fund some travel grants to the annual conference. And there is an annual conference, but it travels around between universities. Basically universities apply to host it. Universities are then responsible for finding funding for it, generally through conference fees. But BILITA also provides a start grant or starting loan that they then pay off when they've basically done their accounting. So I think there are, I'm just mentioning this because I think there are different ways of actually bringing these sorts of networks together, and it depends, I think, how much money you need and how you think about funding your activities, and to what extent the funding of those activities can be distributed in itself. But I think that's a separate question really to ask from whether or not such a network is useful. And I feel that maybe we're probably all in agreement that having a network would be a really, really good idea. So I'm hoping that this is a good starting pistol for that.
Thank you very much. Although the director said we are flexible, I see the technical team saying we are not super flexible still, so we have to close. I think it will be a pleasure to keep this discussion. I hope we will have the opportunity to discuss more in the future, and to meet again to discuss all these issues. Thank you very much, all of you, for all the information and all the insights and the opinions. And and thank you to the organizers. And yes, we leave the floor for the next panel. Thank you very much. See you next time. Bye bye.
See you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.